There is a story the Galactic Council doesn't tell new member species when they join the interstellar community. They don't tell it because it's embarrassing. Because it shook 4 admirals out of their chairs, caused a senior Vorkai general to file an incident report written entirely in what translators later identified as profanity, and resulted in a 17-page diplomatic memo titled, Internally. What do you mean they were just napping? The story starts with a war game. It ends with the most decorated fleet commander in Drathian history standing in a field on a forested moon, staring down at 43 human children curled up in the dirt like a pile of golden retrievers, and whispering, very softly, a word that her species only uses when something has broken their understanding of the universe. The children slept through it. One of them was snoring. This is that story. The war game was supposed to last 6 hours. That was the official schedule, printed in clean Drathian script on the briefing documents that had been distributed to all 7 participating species of the Galactic Coalition's Joint Tactical Advancement Program, or JTAP, which the humans had immediately started calling Strap because one of them explained to a deeply confused Vorkai officer, "That's just funnier." The Vorkai officer had filed this observation in his notes under a header he labeled Behavioral Anomaly, Category, Inexplicable. He had a lot of entries under that category. The war game was a standard evaluation exercise, the kind that JTAP ran every 8 months to assess how well the young military candidates of each species were developing their tactical instincts, their coordination under pressure, their ability to read terrain, and respond to simulated threats. The exercise was called Operation Stonevale, and it had been run 14 times before with 14 different cohorts. The results were always predictable. The Drathian candidates, apex hunters with senses that could track a heartbeat through 3 meters of solid rock, always performed best. The Vorkai candidates, disciplined and methodical, always came second. The Celian candidates, with their hive coordination, always placed third. The others shuffled around the bottom, depending on the terrain type. This was the first time humans had participated. 43 of them, aged between 15 and 17 standard years, drawn from something called the Earth Coalition Junior Ranger Initiative, a program that, according to the documentation, trained young humans in wilderness survival, navigation, and what the paperwork described as outdoor leadership skills. The Drathian officers who reviewed the file had passed it around among themselves and agreed that it sounded like a hobby program. Something humans did for fun, the way Drathians might take cubs to a riverside to teach them to fish. Recreational. Harmless. Not really military training, but then the humans had only been in space for 40 years, and the Coalition was nothing if not patient with new members. Commander Vreth Ka, who was overseeing the exercise from the operations center on the orbital station above the moon-designated Training Ground 7, had looked at the human file, looked at the roster of participating candidates, and made a note. Monitor closely, anticipated early elimination, prepare consolation protocol per Coalition Regulation 7.4. Preservation of emerging species dignity. She was a thorough officer. She planned for everything. She had not planned for this. The moon, Training Ground 7, was a roughly temperate world. Forests of bioluminescent trees that glowed faintly blue-green in the dark, a network of shallow rivers, rocky highland terrain on the northern hemisphere, dense lowland jungle to the south. The simulated threat environment was a series of automated sentry units distributed across the terrain, calibrated to detect candidates and eliminate them from the exercise via a tagging beam that marked their suits with a bright orange indicator. Once tagged, a candidate was considered combat ineffective for the remainder of the exercise. The winning team was whichever species had the most untagged candidates remaining at the 6-hour mark. The rules were simple. Don't get tagged. Tag others if you can, using your team's own handheld tagging devices. Hold whatever territory you could. At the 6-hour mark, a recall signal would sound, and all candidates would return to their designated extraction points. Simple. The Drathian candidates, 16 of them, all from hunting clan lineages, physically imposing even at their age, with a characteristic mottled gray-green skin and large amber eyes that gave their species its exceptional low-light vision, had been given the highland terrain. This was deliberate. Drathians operated at peak efficiency on elevated ground with long sight lines. It played to their strengths and made for a cleaner performance evaluation. The humans had been assigned the lowland jungle sector. Nobody thought much about that assignment. The jungle was considered a moderately difficult terrain for most species. Dense cover made coordination harder. Poor sight lines increased the chance of accidental proximity tags from sentry units. It would challenge the humans without being cruel about it. The exercise began at 0600 local time, with a signal tone broadcast across the entire moon. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded exactly as expected. The Drathians moved through the highlands like ghosts. Silent, coordinated, impossibly still when they needed to be. They evaded every sentry unit in their sector within the first 40 minutes, and spent the remaining time stalking each other's signals on their tracking displays, running mock elimination drills, essentially treating the exercise as recreational. Commander Vrethka watched their telemetry with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a thing done correctly. Their vital signs were calm. Their communication discipline was perfect. They didn't even need to speak. Drathian hunting parties operated on a system of subtle physical signals refined over 50,000 years of evolution. A gesture, a posture, a tilt of the head, and the candidates used them the way their parents and grandparents had used them in forests far older and darker than this one. The Vorkai performed as expected. Disciplined, methodical, a few early losses to sentry contact, but good recoveries. The Celian candidates maintained their hive coordination beautifully. The others did what they usually did. The humans' telemetry looked normal. 43 signals, moving through the jungle sector. Irregular movement patterns, which the observation team initially flagged as possible navigation difficulty. The humans' biomonitors showed elevated heart rates, elevated body temperature, consistent with exertion in humid conditions. They were working hard. They were moving. Their team communication frequency showed activity. Short, rapid exchanges, a lot of crosstalk, occasional laughter, which the Vorkai monitoring officer annotated as unprofessional but within acceptable parameters. Then, at approximately the 2-hour mark, something changed. The telemetry didn't change. That was the thing. The signals were still there, still clustered in the jungle sector, still transmitting. But the movement stopped. All 43 human candidates, within a span of about 11 minutes, went from active movement to complete stillness. The monitoring officer flagged it. Vrethka looked at the display. 43 stationary signals, all clustered in a roughly circular area approximately 2 kilometers in diameter in the southern lowland jungle. All biomonitors active. Heart rates dropping. Not to dangerous levels, but dropping steadily in that long, slow slope that the medical AI recognized and labeled with a small green notation, sleep. Natural, non-induced. They're sleeping, the Vorkai officer said. His name was Subcommander Orcs, and he had been monitoring human behavior for 6 months and thought, until this moment, that he was beginning to understand them. Vrethka looked at the display for a long time. Run the diagnostic, she said. The diagnostic came back clean. No equipment malfunction. No gas event. No medical emergency. 43 humans, in the middle of an active combat exercise, in a simulated threat environment with sentry units actively patrolling their sector, had collectively decided to lie down and go to sleep. Contact the human liaison officer, Vrethka said very carefully. Lieutenant Perveen Siddiqui, Earth Coalition liaison to JDAP, was a small woman with dark hair and the particular expression of someone who has been woken up from a nap by a fire alarm. She had been in the observation center's secondary briefing room, catching up on paperwork. She appeared on the comm screen, noted the tight expression on Vrethka's face, and said, with the wariness of a person who has learned to be wary, "What did they do?" "Your candidates," Vrethka said, "have stopped moving." A pause. "Are they tagged?" "No." "Are they injured?" "No." "Are the biomonitors malfunctioning?" "No." Another pause. Longer. Siddiqui looked at the telemetry display that Vrethka had shared to the secondary screen, and she went quiet in a way that was not the quiet of alarm, but the quiet of someone working very hard to keep a specific expression off their face. Lieutenant Vrethka said, "Our biomedical AI is indicating their candidates are asleep," Siddiqui said. "Asleep." "Yes. In the middle of the exercise." "It looks like it." Vrethka had been commanding officers for 23 years. She had supervised war games on 16 different worlds. She had once managed a training exercise in which a Vorkai candidate, overcome by some ancestral territorial instinct, had attempted to actually fight a sentry unit with his bare hands. She had handled that with calm professionalism. This was different. "Why?" she said. "Are they asleep?" Siddiqui was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Commander, can I ask, what time is it on their assigned sector right now?" "Local solar time, Vretkatsetsked, approximately 0810. "And when did the exercise start?" 0600. "So they've been active for 2 hours and 10 minutes. "Correct. In humid jungle terrain." "Correct. After being transported to a new moon yesterday and spending the night in temporary quarters with different atmospheric composition, gravity, and ambient light cycles than they're accustomed to." Vretkapausit. She had not, it must be admitted, considered any of that. "Commander," Siddiqui said, and now she was definitely working to keep something out of her voice. We're not always at our best on disrupted sleep schedules, especially teenagers. And when they're physically fatigued in a safe-feeling environment, she stopped. "They're probably fine. They'll wake up. The exercise ends in 4 hours. "I know. They're going to lose the exercise. "I know. They haven't tagged a single opposing candidate. "I'm aware. They're not going to tag any opposing candidates while they are asleep. "Yes. I understand the tactical implications." A breath. "I'm sorry, Commander. I'll reach out through the team's assigned communication officer and don't." Siddiqui blinked. "Commander?" Brethka looked at the display. 43 small signals, motionless, clustered in the southern jungle. Something about the image nagged at her in a way she couldn't immediately name. "Don't wake them," she said. "Let the exercise continue." She cut the comm and looked at the display for a long time. She looked at where they had stopped. She pulled up the terrain overlay and examined the topography of that cluster of signals. She looked at the positions of the sentry units that were, even now, actively patrolling the jungle around that location. Something about the pattern was strange. She zoomed in. The humans had stopped in a shallow natural depression in the jungle floor, ringed on 3 sides by dense root columns from the bioluminescent trees, the kind that grew in overlapping tangles at the base and created what the terrain survey called natural barrier formations. The depression itself was low enough that a prone figure inside it would fall below the standard sentry sweep angle. The root formations broke up the thermal signature that the sentry units used as a secondary detection method. The overhead canopy was thick enough that atmospheric movement, which some of the more sophisticated sentry units used for tertiary detection, was minimal. The humans had apparently looked at the jungle sector, found the single spot in their assigned area that was effectively invisible to sentry detection, walked to it, and gone to sleep in it. Brethka pulled up the sentry unit logs. In the 2 hours and 10 minutes since the exercise began, the sentry units in the southern jungle sector had swept through that area 4 times. They had not detected a single human candidate. She pulled up the human team's communication log. The crosstalk she'd noted earlier, the rapid short exchanges, the laughter. She ran it through the translation system. It was not tactical coordination. It was, as best the translator could determine, a debate about which spot in the jungle was most comfortable to sleep in, combined with something called a merit badge joke that the translator flagged as humor, context unclear, and at least one human candidate saying, with great conviction, that if they slept in the root formation, they would be totally invisible to anything that uses heat sensors. I did the math. Trust me. Brethka read this 3 times. Then, she sat back in her chair. On the display, 43 human candidates slept peacefully in the jungle below, invisible to every sentry unit on the moon, untagged, unbothered, technically still active participants in an exercise that would end in just under 4 hours. Orith leaned over from his station. "Commander, should we?" "No," Vrethka said. "But the exercise, let it run," she said. She did not take her eyes off the display. Outside, on Training Ground 7, in a depression in the jungle floor ringed by glowing roots, 43 human teenagers were curled up in the dirt like a pile of golden retrievers. One of them had used another one as a pillow. 3 of them were, by the audio pickup, snoring. One had apparently brought a snack and eaten it before falling asleep because there was a wrapper. The medical AI noted that their collective cortisol levels, which had been elevated on arrival, had dropped to baseline. They were, by every measurable indicator, completely at peace. The sentry units swept the sector again. Detected nothing. Vrethka folded her hands on her console and began, very carefully, to revise every assumption she had made about this cohort. It took her the rest of the exercise. The recall signal sounded at noon. It was a 3-tone sequence broadcast simultaneously across every sector of Training Ground 7, clear, and unmistakable, designed to cut through any ambient noise, any terrain, any atmospheric condition the moon could produce. The Coalition's audio engineers had spent considerable effort on the recall signal. It was by design impossible to sleep through. The Drathian candidates responded in 4.3 seconds. Formed up at their extraction point in under 2 minutes, standing in precise formation, not a single one tag, calm, and still in the way that large predators are calm. Not relaxed exactly, but resting the way a coiled spring rests. The Vorkai candidates took 6.1 seconds to respond and were formed up in 3 minutes. A few orange tags from sentry contacts, but good discipline in the formation. The Celian candidates were 8.7 seconds and 4 minutes. Expected. The human extraction point was a cleared area at the northern edge of the jungle sector, a flat stretch of ground with good sight lines, and a landing marker. Vrethka had the camera feeds from all extraction points on her main display. She watched the others form up with the satisfaction of a process completing correctly. She watched the human extraction point. Nothing. 1 minute past recall. 2 minutes. The other species candidates were giving their readiness confirmations, and the human extraction point was still empty, and Vrethka was beginning to revise her earlier revised assumptions back toward they're just asleep when the first one appeared. He came out of the tree line at a jog, still pulling something over his head, a shirt of all things because apparently he had slept without it, and behind him came the rest of them in ones and twos and small clusters, emerging from the jungle with the particular energy of people who had slept well and were not yet entirely done being pleased about it. One of them was eating something. Another one had leaves in her hair and did not appear to have noticed. A third was in the middle of a conversation with the person next to him, gesturing with one hand while the other hand rubbed sleep from his eye. They were not in formation. They were not going to be in formation, not in any sense that the word meant to Vrethka or Orith or anyone else in the operations center, because they were human teenagers who had just woken up from a nap and were now ambling toward the extraction marker with the approximate military discipline of a school group on a field trip. But they were all there. 43. Vrethka chonted. Then counted again. 43 human candidates, all biomonitors active, all vital signs in range, all with clean suits, not a single orange tag mark among them. They had spent 6 hours in an active simulated threat environment, surrounded by sentry units, and not one of them had been tagged, because they had been asleep. Final standings, Orith said, pulling up the exercise results. The Drathians had lost 2 candidates to a sentry unit in their last hour, when they had gotten ambitious and started pursuing each other's signals. Still a strong showing, 14 untagged out of 16. The Celians had lost 7. The Vorkai had lost 5. When the board updated to include the human count, the operations center went briefly quiet. 43 out of 43. That's not possible, one of the junior monitoring officers said from the back of the room. He was a young Drathian officer on his first rotation with JTAP, and he said it with the conviction of someone whose entire understanding of the universe has just been handed back to him with a dent in it. And yet Vrethka said. She pulled up the exercise report format and stared at it for a moment. The Coalition's after-action report system had a field for tactical assessment of candidate performance. She had filled this field 14 times. She had always had a clear sense of what to write. She did not have a clear sense now. The human candidates below had found the extraction marker and were standing near it in rough approximation of a group, still talking, still eating whatever they had found to eat. One of them now braiding the hair of the one who had leaves in hers. 3 of them were examining the sentry unit that had been stationed near the extraction marker. It had been deactivated at recall, and they were looking at it the way humans apparently looked at everything interesting, which was to say with their faces close to it, and their hands reaching out to touch parts of it. 2 of the sentry unit's panels had been opened by the time Vrethka noticed and told the extraction team to intervene. She wrote in the tactical assessment field, unorthodox. Reviewing. She saved the document. She stared at the ceiling of the operations center for a moment. Then, she started making calls. The first call was to General Heseth, Drathian High Command's liaison to JTAP. Heseth was 300 years old, which for a Drathian put her somewhere in the dignified middle of a natural lifespan, and she had the bearing of someone who had been important for so long that it had become simply a fact about her, like her height. She listened to Vrethka's summary without interrupting. When Vrethka finished, there was a long pause. They slept, Heseth said. For approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes, Vrethka confirmed. During the exercise, yes, and were not detected. Not once. Another pause. Longer. Send me the terrain analysis, Heseth said. Vrethka sent it. And the sentry sweep logs. Vrethka sent those too. Heseth was quiet for almost 4 minutes, which was long enough that Vrethka checked twice to make sure the connection was still active. Their caloric consumption, Heseth said at last. What was it post-exercise? Vrethka blinked. It was not a question she had expected. She pulled up the medical logs from the post-exercise nutrition station where all candidates refueled. Substantial, she said, reviewing the numbers. By coalition standards for their body mass, approximately 3 times the expected rate. They were storing energy before they slept. That's the medical assessment, yes. And the location they chose. The depression. The root formations. The terrain analysis. I read the terrain analysis, Heseth said. I'm asking whether you believe they chose it or found it by accident. A very good question. Vrethka had been thinking about it since noon. The path their telemetry shows them taking, from the insertion point to the final location, is not a direct route. They moved through 3 distinct alternative areas before converging on the depression. The timing of the moves correlates with sentry sweep intervals. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. They timed their movement to the sentry sweeps, Heseth said. That is one interpretation. They moved between sweeps, selected terrain that defeated the detection systems, ate until they were full, and then went to sleep. Yes, they treated the exercise like a hunt. Vrethka had not used that word, but now that Heseth had said it, she couldn't unsay it, and she found that it fit. The patience, the energy conservation, the use of terrain, the timing. Yes, Vrethka said, that is the most accurate description I have. Another long pause. I want to observe the next integration session, Heseth said. Schedule it. Don't tell them I'm observing. She ended the call. Vrethka sat with that for a moment, then made her second call. Lieutenant Siddiqui answered on the second tone, still wearing the expression of someone waiting for a verdict. Your candidates performed adequately, Vrethka said. Siddiqui's expression did something complicated. Adequately. Untagged. All 43. The complicated expression shifted. Something in it that Vrethka was beginning to learn to recognize as the human effort not to smile too broadly in a professional context. Yes. That's good. Can I ask you a question, Lieutenant? Of course. The Junior Ranger Initiative. The training program they come from. Vrethka pulled up the file again, the one she had read before the exercise and categorized as recreational. What does it train them to do? Siddiqui seemed to consider how to answer. Survive, she said after a moment. Mostly, how to read terrain, how to find shelter, how to conserve energy, how to move without being detected by predators, how to stay alive in environments that aren't friendly to them, how to hide. That's a significant component, yes. How to rest while remaining tactically undetectable. Siddiqui was quiet for a moment. They learn when it's safe to sleep and when it isn't, she said. That's actually one of the core skills. Knowing when you can afford to stop. Vrethka looked at the telemetry from the exercise. The smooth, slow slope of 43 heart rates dropping into sleep in an environment they had already assessed, already secured, already hidden in. They knew they were safe, Vrethka said. I think so. They made themselves safe, and then they slept. Yes. And they did it in under 2 hours in a terrain they had never entered before against detection systems they had never encountered before. There's Siddiqui paused. They're adaptable. They've been training in Earth's wild areas since they were 10. A lot of what's in that jungle isn't actually that different structurally from what they know. Roots, canopy, ground cover. The sentry units are different, obviously, but the logic of how to avoid detection is the same, more or less. Vrethka looked at the 43 dots on her display, now moving toward the transport vehicles that would carry them back to the orbital station. She watched the way they moved in clusters, loose and easy, the body language of people who had had a good day. Lieutenant, she said, how long have humans been hunting? Siddiqui was quiet for a moment. Long time, she said. Longer than we've had cities. Longer than we've had writing. A very long time. And have you always hunted the way your candidates behave today? The patience, the terrain selection, the energy management. Siddiqui took a breath. We didn't always start at the top of the food chain, she said. We spent a long time being the thing that something else was hunting. That changes how you learn to move. Vrethka let that sit in the quiet of the operations center. Around her, the junior officers were filing the exercise results, running the post-exercise diagnostics, doing all the ordinary administrative work that followed an ordinary training exercise. This had not been an ordinary training exercise. She knew that now, with a clarity that was almost physical, a shift in her understanding that reminded her of the feeling of ground giving way beneath a foot, that instant of adjustment before the body catches itself. She had expected to observe 43 young humans struggling with a combat exercise designed for species with better evolved senses and sharper tactical instincts. She had instead watched 43 young humans treat a war game the way their ancestors had treated the African savanna. Survive. Rest when you can. Move when it's safe. Eat when there's food. And never, ever let anything know exactly where you are. Schedule the next integration session, she told Orith when she ended the call with Siddiqui. Standard format? No, she said. Something harder. She pulled up the training catalog, looked at the exercises listed under the advanced cohort tier, the ones normally reserved for second-year candidates from established species, the ones that were not supposed to run for first-rotation participants. She picked one. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked back at her display, where 43 human teenagers were boarding their transport, loud and easy, somebody laughing at something, somebody starting what looked like an argument about the snack wrapper that had been left in the jungle, and whether it was littering or not, somebody else pulling out the leaves that were still in her hair, and looking at them with interest. Vrethka made a note. They are not what the file describes. Revise all prior assessments. Proceed with elevated observation priority. She looked at what she'd written, added one more line. Do not underestimate again. The next exercise was called Operation Deep Veil. It had never been run with a first rotation cohort before. Vrethka had known that when she chose it, and she had chosen it anyway, and she had spent the 3 days between exercises quietly preparing for the possibility that she would need to explain her reasoning to her superiors. She was not a reckless commander. She had a record of careful, measured decisions. But something about this southern jungle, about 43 signals sitting motionless and undetectable in the dark while every sweep went over them without a flicker, had shifted something in her approach to this cohort. She needed to know, not just what they would do when it was easy, what they would do when it wasn't. Operation Deep Veil was, in structural terms, a reversal of Operation Stone Veil. Instead of avoiding detection, the candidate teams had to locate and tag designated targets. Mobile units running evasion protocols, programmed to behave like sentient entities in active concealment. The mobile units used every available terrain feature, moved in irregular patterns, used decoys, and changed behavior based on prior contact. They were, in short, designed to be genuinely difficult to find. In every prior run of Deep Veil, the Drathian candidates had performed best. This was expected. Tracking was their evolutionary heritage the way metabolism was a human one, deep, instinctive, woven into the way they process sensory information. Their detection rates in prior runs averaged 78% across the target set. The other species' averages range from 31% to 49%. Vrethka had set the standard assessment threshold for first-rotation cohorts at 25%. Below that, she would flag for remedial support. Above it, baseline pass. She did not share these numbers with a human team. She did not share them with anyone except Orith, who received them with the quiet expression of a person who has decided, based on prior experience, to suspend judgment until the data arrives. General Heseth was in the observation center. She had arrived the previous evening, occupied a seat in the back row with a cup of something warm, and had not, since her arrival, said a great deal to anyone. She sat with the stillness of a Drathian elder at rest. Not passive, not detached, but gathered the way energy gathers before it moves. She watched the display. She said nothing. The exercise launched at 0600 again. The human candidates were inserted into the southern lowland sector of Training Ground 7. Same moon, different exercise configuration. The mobile target units were distributed across a wider area this time. 12 targets total, each team responsible for their sector's allocation. Humans assigned 3 targets in the jungle lowlands. For the first 20 minutes, the human telemetry showed a pattern that the monitoring team had now started to recognize. Movement to an initial staging position, a pause, and then a different kind of movement. Not the direct route that the Vorkai used, not the wide sweep pattern the Drathians preferred, but something else. Something that, when you plotted it on the terrain overlay, looked less like a tactical advance, and more like water finding the low points in ground. They moved through every gap, every natural corridor between tree formations, every shadow, every low point, every place where the overhead canopy was dense enough to break up the visual line. They moved through the jungle the way the jungle moved, with the grain of it, not against it, and they did not make more noise than the jungle already made. Their movement's signature, Orcs said quietly. I see it, Vrethka said. The mobile target units used a detection system that combined visual, thermal, and audio inputs. The programming was sophisticated. The units were designed to be startled by sudden movement, to respond to anomalous sound, to track thermal signatures that broke the background baseline. The human candidates had spread out. Single file had become a loose dispersal, each candidate separated from the next by enough distance that their combined thermal output didn't spike the background reading. Their movement pace was slow, slower than Vrethka would have expected, slower than the Drathians, slower than the Vorkai. But when she watched the terrain overlay and traced their paths, she could see what they were doing. They were using the sound of the jungle. Training Ground 7's lowland jungle had ambient noise, bioluminescent insects, something that functioned like birds in the upper canopy, the movement of shallow water through root systems. Not loud, but constant. A background texture of sound that was always present. The humans were moving when the ambient noise peaked and stopping when it dropped. Using the sound cover the way they had used the terrain depression, not finding silence, but finding noise. Hiding themselves in something that was always there. One of the junior monitoring officers, a young Celian named Threat, had been watching the display for 40 minutes in increasing silence. He turned to Vrethka now and said, Commander, where did they learn that? They didn't learn it here, she said. The first target contact came at the 43-minute mark. The targeting team had designated the contacts with designations Alpha, Beta, and Gamma in the human sector. Alpha was running an evasion pattern in the denser northern portion of the lowland jungle. Beta was using a rocky creek bed for cover, moving along the water's edge, which masked its thermal signature and audio profile. Gamma was the most sophisticated of the three, a full decoy loop, doubling back on its own path to create confusion, using a programmed hesitation behavior that the Coalition's AI engineers had specifically designed to exploit the instinct to pursue the most recently identified signal. Alpha went down at minute 43, not to a pursuing group, to a single candidate who had apparently identified Alpha's pattern and gotten ahead of it, not chasing the signal, but going where the signal was going and waiting. The tag came from a static position. No pursuit. No running contact. A patient preposition tag from a candidate who was lying in the undergrowth when Alpha walked into range. Vrethka stared at the contact report. Did she predict the movement vector? Orth said, that's what the playback shows. She got ahead of it. Yes. Heseth, from the back of the room, said nothing. But she set down her cup. Beta went down at minute 51 to a coordinated group push that funneled it out of the creek bed. Not by chasing it, by three candidates moving in parallel along the creek's edge, maintaining the same pace, neither closing nor retreating, slowly compressing the lateral movement space until Beta had nowhere to go but out of the water. When it surfaced from the creek bed, another candidate was waiting. They herded it, Threat said, almost to himself. Orth pulled up the replay. Watched it twice. That is exactly what they did. They didn't chase it. They moved it. Gamma was the problem. The decoy loop behavior was designed specifically to bait a pursuing team into committing to a direction and then looping back behind them. In every prior Deep Veil run, Gamma-type units had successfully escaped roughly 70% of contact attempts by triggering this behavior. The pursuing team would follow the signal, the unit would double back, and suddenly the unit was behind the team rather than ahead of it, and the contact was broken. The human candidates did not pursue Gamma. They found it. Not by chasing the signal, by stopping, spreading out, and waiting for Gamma to complete its loop. When Gamma doubled back, it found a loose perimeter of candidates distributed at intervals in the undergrowth, none of them moving, all of them still enough that Gamma's audio detection registered nothing. The thermal spread was too diffuse to trigger the spike response. Gamma, completing its loop with the confident programming of a system that expected to emerge behind a pursuing team, came out of the dense undergrowth, into a quiet ring of humans who had been there for 11 minutes. The tag hit it from 3 directions almost simultaneously. Final contact time for the human sector, Orcs said, pulling up the numbers. 1 hour, 7 minutes. All 3 targets acquired. The Drathian sector was still active. The Vorkai sector was still active. Vrethka looked at the results and then looked at the ceiling of the operations center, which was becoming familiar in a way that ceilings of operations centers usually were not, because she kept looking at it when she needed a moment to put her understanding back together. 3 targets, all acquired, under 40% of the expected exercise duration, using a cohort that had never run this exercise before in a species whose tactical training files described them as early development, recreational background, monitor for confidence impact. Heseth had moved from the back of the room to the seat beside Vrethka's console. The Gamma contact, she said. Her voice was very neutral. Yes, they anticipated the decoy behavior. They created a counter-decoy, Vrethka said. They gave Gamma a loop to run by staying visible enough to register as a pursuing team, then dispersed into static positions before the loop completed. Heseth was quiet for a moment. The female who predicted Alpha's movement vector, she said. How old? Vrethka checked the file. 16 standard years. What is 16 human years? Approximately equivalent to a young Drathian cub at the second hunting instruction stage. Another pause. Longer. My grand cubs, Heseth said, cannot predict a movement vector. They cannot do it because they have not yet been taught to think about prey in terms of pattern rather than position. That skill comes at the 4th instruction stage. It requires specific instruction and repetition over a period of years before it becomes reliable. She looked at the display, where the replay of Alpha's tag was looping on a secondary screen. The human candidate in the undergrowth, still and patient as a root. Alpha walking into range with the programmed confidence of a unit that did not expect to be anticipated. The tag. How long has she been training? The file says 6 years in the Junior Ranger Initiative. Since age 10. Heseth made a sound that Vrethka's translator rendered as consideration with weight. Something thoughtful but dense with it. The program trains them in wilderness survival, Heseth said. You told me this. Yes. But what they're demonstrating is not survival. Survival is passive. What they're demonstrating is, she stopped. Predator cognition, Vrethka said. Because that was the word. She had been working around it for 2 days. Yes, Heseth said. Where did they acquire predator cognition? Their file says they are an omnivorous species of moderate sensory capability. No exceptional visual acuity, no sonar, no electromagnetic sense. Standard mammalian threat assessment. They've been hunting for a long time, Vrethka said. She was thinking about what Siddiqui had said. We didn't always start at the top of the food chain. Heseth looked at her. They used to be prey, Vrethka said, and then they learned to hunt. And they spent a very long time doing both simultaneously, being hunted by something larger, and hunting things smaller, and learning to think like both at the same time. Heseth sat with that. On the display, the Drathian team had located one of their targets, and were closing. Beautiful to watch. The coordinated silence, the perfect positioning. They would get it. They were excellent. But it had taken them longer. Because the Drathians had only ever needed to think like hunters. Schedule an integration session, Heseth said, standing. I want to observe the human candidates in direct contact with the Drathian candidates. A mixed team exercise. General, mixed team exercises are typically reserved for final rotation cohorts. Schedule it, Heseth said. She was already walking toward the door. And don't put in the standard reports until I've seen the results. She stopped at the door. Looked back at the display. 43 human candidates were forming up at the extraction point again. Loud, loose, completely at ease with themselves. Someone was doing what appeared to be an impression of the Gamma unit's confused loop behavior and making everyone around them laugh. Heseth watched this for a moment. They think it was fun, she said. Not a question. An observation. They appear to, yes, Vrethka said. The gamma decoy, the counter-loop strategy they devised that in the field, in real time, under exercise conditions. The communication logs confirm it. They discussed it before dispersing. It took them 4 minutes to agree on the approach and position. For minutes, Heseth said. Yes. Heseth looked at the display one more time. Then she left. Vrethka sat in the quiet of the operations center, the hum of systems around her, Orith filling in the exercise reports at his station, Threat, and the other junior officers murmuring about the results with the tone of people who were still working out what they had seen. She pulled up the human team's file. The section labeled Assessment Summary still said what it had said when this cohort arrived. Early development, recreational background, monitor for confidence impact. She deleted all of it. She typed, see attached exercise records. Recommend immediate reclassification. Prior assessment invalid. She thought about that for a moment. Added one more line. Recommend cross-species integration, priority scheduling. These candidates are not what the classification system has a category for yet. We need one. She saved the file. Outside, on the transport back to the orbital station, 43 human teenagers were having an argument about something she couldn't quite make out on the audio feed. It was animated, loud, and apparently very funny because it kept dissolving into laughter. She suspected they had already moved on to thinking about what they were going to eat. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not find this reassuring. She found it, instead, deeply interesting. The mixed team exercise had no official name. Vrethka had listed it in the scheduling system as Integration Session 7, Advanced Variant, because she needed something on the form and because she was not yet ready to give a name to something she didn't fully understand yet. Names came after understanding, in her experience. You named things once you knew what they were. She did not yet know what this was. The exercise paired each human candidate with one Drathian candidate, in teams of 2, with a joint objective: locate and extract a simulated casualty unit from a restricted zone against a full sentry deployment calibrated to standard combat detection sensitivity. The casualty unit was stationary, broadcasting a low-frequency distress signal that any detection equipment could track, placed in the deepest and most heavily covered section of the training terrain. Getting to it required crossing 4 sentry sweep corridors, 2 active patrol routes, and a thermal scan zone designed to catch moving bodies at close range. It was, by the standards of a first rotation exercise, extremely difficult. General Heseth had suggested it. Vrethka had agreed, because by this point she had learned to be curious about what the humans would do rather than predictive about it, and the pairing was the part she was most curious about. 2 species with entirely different sensory profiles, entirely different movement instincts, entirely different approaches to stillness and sound. A Drathian cub who had grown up in hunting clan culture, trained since early childhood to move with absolute silence and communicate without speech, paired with a human teenager who had learned to move through wilderness by reading terrain with their whole body and had apparently never met a silence they didn't want to fill with conversation. She gave the teams 2 hours of orientation, then launched the exercise. The first thing that happened was that the human candidates started talking to the Drathian candidates. This was, in retrospect, entirely predictable. Vrethka watched it on the communication feeds, short, practical exchanges, initially halting because the translation system had a small lag, and the Drathian candidates were not accustomed to verbal real-time communication in the field. Their hunting signals were physical, gestural, built for silence. Being asked, "What do you see from that angle?" by a human partner required them to process the question, translate it into a verbal response, and say it out loud, all of which was genuinely unfamiliar work. But the human candidates waited. That was what surprised Vrethka. She had expected impatience. The human communication logs from prior exercises had shown exactly the kind of rapid-fire crosstalk that suggested an instinct toward filling gaps. Questions answered before they were finished, overlapping observations, the constant low hum of verbal output. But, paired with Drathian partners, the human candidates went quieter. Not silent. They still talked, but they paced themselves to their partners. Asked a question, then waited the full beat for the answer, even when the answer was slow. One pair, in the northwest sector, had developed what appeared to be a hybrid communication system within 30 minutes of the exercise starting. The Drathian candidate, his name was Arath, clan records showing him as one of the top performers in his cohort, had taught his human partner 4 of the basic gesture signals. The human, a girl named Camilla, 16, from somewhere on the Pacific coast of North America, had learned them, apparently, by watching Arath twice and then mirroring them back. The 4th time she used one, she used it correctly in context without prompting at the right moment. Arath had paused, looked at her, then continued moving. Orith, watching this on the feed, said very quietly, she learned 4 hunting signals in 30 minutes. She learned them in about 10 minutes, Vrethka said. The other 20 were practice. The first sentry corridor was the straightest challenge, a wide beam sweep at regular intervals, covering open ground between 2 tree formations. The standard approach for a Drathian pair was to read the interval, time the crossing, move in the gap. Clean, precise. But a Drathian pair moved with nearly identical gait and similar thermal profiles. A mixed pair presented differently, different heights, different thermal outputs, different movement rhythms. Arath and Camilla solved it by not crossing together. Arath went first, naturally, because his movement signature was close to baseline for the terrain, trained to minimalism. When he reached the far side and pressed himself into the shadow of a root column, he gave the gesture for clear. Camilla had already identified the pattern on her own scanner. She went across in the gap, and she went across the way she had moved through the jungle in the first exercise, following the grain of the ground, using the ambient sound, trusting the terrain to absorb her. The sweep went over, detected nothing. On the display, a dozen other pairs were moving through their respective corridor challenges. The results were variable. A few Drathian candidates were visibly adjusting to the pace disruption of working with a human partner. Their instinct was to move faster and quieter than humans naturally moved, and the accommodation was showing in their telemetry. A few human candidates were struggling with the silence discipline, the communication feed showing suppressed gaps where they had started to speak and stop themselves. But they were adapting. All of them, on both sides, were actively adapting. Vrethka watched this and felt something shift in her understanding that she did not yet have a word for. The Drathian candidates had trained their whole young lives to move as hunters, to suppress the self, to empty themselves of everything that wasn't the terrain and the target. It was beautiful training. It produced exceptional results. But it was a discipline built on one mode. The human candidates operated in multiple modes simultaneously. They moved like prey when they needed to low and quiet and grain of the earth patient. They moved like hunters when the moment required it. They talked when talking helped and went quiet when quiet was needed. They watched their partners and changed. They did not operate on a single frequency. They were, Vrethka thought, extraordinarily difficult to define. The second sentry corridor was the thermal scan zone, which was designed specifically to catch the residual heat signatures of living bodies. You could suppress your movement. You could suppress your sound. You couldn't suppress your metabolism. This was the one element of the exercise that Vrethka had expected to genuinely trouble the human candidates, because they ran warm, warmer than Drathians, warmer than Vorkai, warmer than any other species in this cohort, and their thermal signatures were distinctive. Pair 7 discovered the solution. His name was Marcus, 17, tall in a way that seemed slightly disproportionate, with the easy loping gait of someone who had spent a lot of time moving through terrain that required ducking under things. He stopped at the edge of the thermal zone, crouched, and spent approximately 90 seconds looking at the zone without moving. Then, he said something to his Drathian partner, a female candidate named Cyrith, that the translation system rendered as the sensor reads body heat. Right, but it's looking for bodies, it's looking for the shape of a body, not just warmth. If we use the root formations to break up our shape, he stopped. Pointed. Gestured. Cyrith looked where he pointed. The root formations in the thermal zone were dense and irregular, biological shapes that produced their own faint heat, because the bioluminescent chemistry that made the trees glow also made them warm, slightly, the way a living thing is warm. Not enough to confuse a sensor looking for a human-shaped signature, but enough to provide cover if you move through them rather than between them. Not over them, not around them, through them. Marcus squeezed himself into the root tangle on the zone's edge. It was not graceful. It produced one muffled sound that Cyrith visibly flinched at. But he emerged on the other side, on hands and knees, his thermal profile broken and distributed across the root mass in a way that the sensor registered as a regular biological background. Cyrith looked at this for a moment. Then she followed him through. She was faster and quieter about it, but she followed him. In the operations center, nobody said anything for a long moment. He used the environment as camouflage for his thermal signature. Orith said, finally. He used the environment to disguise the shape of his signature. Vrethka corrected. He didn't mask the heat. He distributed it. Made himself look like a root. Heseth had been standing at the back of the room for 3 hours. She came forward now, to the console, and stood beside Vrethka without speaking, and watched Marcus and Cyrith move through the thermal zone on the display. Then, she watched 2 more pairs attempt the same approach with variations. One pair found a different angle through the root formations. One pair used a timing gap in the scan interval combined with the root cover. One pair, a human candidate named De Jong and his Drathian partner Rethka, moved through so slowly and so low that by the time the scan hit their position, they were pressed flat against a root column in a posture that the medical AI flagged as unusual body compression. Voluntary. They were making themselves thin. They were making themselves flat. They were making themselves as much as a living body with a spine and lungs can manage in a part of the ground. Heseth said, quietly, a Drathian cub does not learn to suppress their profile like that until the 3rd hunting stage. That technique is taught specifically and practiced over years. It requires conscious control of musculature that most species do not learn to consciously control. De Jong is from a family that has practiced a martial discipline called Hapkido for 3 generations, Vrethka said. She had looked at the files. She had looked at all of them in the days between exercises. Part of the discipline involves something called body awareness training, conscious control of tension and posture. He's been doing it since he was 8. Heseth looked at her. They all have backgrounds like this, Vrethka said. Not identical, different disciplines, different regions, different specific skills. But all of them have been trained in their bodies and in terrain since early childhood. The Ranger Initiative selected for it. And before the initiative, their families, their cultures, some of them have been passing this knowledge down for generations. Longer. Heseth was quiet. That girl who predicted Alpha's movement vector, Vrethka said. Her file notes that she grew up in a region of North America that her people have hunted for several thousand years. Her grandmother still hunts. Her mother is a ranger in the same forests. She has been learning to read movement patterns since she was 5 years old. The exercise was drawing towards close. Pairs were converging on the casualty unit's position. The first pair to reach it was Arath and Camilla, who had been the farthest along at the last check, and who arrived 4 minutes ahead of the next team, which was Marcus and Cyrith. Camilla touched the casualty unit, and the confirmation ping came through the system, and on the audio feed, Vrethka heard Arath say something in Drathian, something the translator hesitated on before rendering it as well found, which was, Vrethka happened to know, the traditional Drathian hunting clan phrase for acknowledging a good kill. Arath had never, in her observation, said it to another Drathian candidate. He had said it to a human girl on a moon neither of them was from. The exercise completed. The results came in. 38 of the 43 pairs had reached the casualty unit successfully. The 5 who hadn't had been tagged, all in the thermal zone, which remained a genuine challenge even for the adapted approaches. But 38 of 43 in an exercise rated advanced cohort level by mixed first rotation pairs who had never worked together before, with less than 1 day of preparation. Heseth stood at the console for a long time after the numbers finalized. Vrethka did not interrupt the silence. She had learned, over the past 10 days, to let things sit when they needed to. In my years of command, Heseth said at last, I have observed many species young at training. I have seen what the young of apex predators look like in their first exercises. I know what that looks like. The confidence, the instinct, the comfort in their own capability. She paused. These humans are not the young of an apex predator. Their species was not always at the top of their world's chain. They know, somewhere deep in the body, what it is to be prey. Yes, Vrethka said, and they have chosen to become something else anyway. Heseth looked at the display, where the candidates were at their extraction points, the Drathian and human candidates standing in proximity for the first time since the exercise began, The conversation feeds showing a sudden surge of activity. Both sides apparently wanted to talk now that silence wasn't required. That is not instinct, Heseth said. Instinct is what you were born with. That is decision, carried down through generations until it became culture, until it became body memory, until it became them, Vrethka said. Them Heseth agreed. The extraction teams were finishing up. On the audio, Camilla was teaching Irath something, her voice demonstrating what sounded like a human idiom for a successful hunt, and Irath repeating it with the careful precision of someone learning a new signal. It sounded ridiculous in Drathian phonology. It made Camilla laugh, and then, after a moment, it made Irath make a sound that the translator said was the Drathian equivalent of amusement. Two different kinds of hunters, 40 light years from both their homes, teaching each other words for the same thing. Heseth turned away from the display. Prepare a full assessment report, she said. Flag it for the council's attention. Recommend permanent reclassification of human candidates within the JTAP framework. She paused at the door, in the same spot she had paused before. And include the operation records. All of them. Let the council see what happened in that jungle on the first day. The sleeping incident, Orcs said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite laughter, but was close to it. The sleeping incident, Heseth confirmed. She sounded, for the first time since her arrival, almost warm. Let them see what it looks like when a species that has survived everything their world has thrown at them decides to participate in a war game. She opened the door. Let them see what resting in enemy terrain looks like when it is done by something that has been doing it for 200,000 years. She left. The door closed. Orth looked at Vrethka. Vrethka looked at the display. 43 human candidates, 20 Drathian candidates, clustered at extraction points on a training moon, the sound of two kinds of laughter mixing in the audio feed. And somewhere in there, Camilla saying something that made Irath repeat the word for well found again. And this time, Vrethka thought he said it without the careful precision. He said it the way you say a word once it has settled into you. The way you say something that has become, after enough repetition, a reflex. She wrote the report. She wrote it carefully and completely, beginning with the first exercise, the first telemetry flag, the moment she had stared at 43 motionless signals in a jungle and started revising everything she thought she knew. She wrote it through every exercise, every contact report, every moment that had added weight to an understanding she was still building. She included the terrain analysis, the movement studies, the gamma counter loop, the thermal zone adaptations, the cross-species communication development. She included the sleeping incident. She wrote, at the end of the assessment section, these candidates do not fit the existing classification framework. They are not what their documentation describes. They're not beginners. They are the young of a species that learned to survive being hunted, learned to become hunters themselves, and has spent an interval of time long enough to be humbling encoding that knowledge into the bodies and minds of their children. What arrived on Training Ground 7 was not a recreational youth cohort. What arrived was something the Coalition has not yet developed adequate language for. I recommend we begin developing it. She attached all the exercise records. She sent it. Then she sat in the quiet operations center, the hum of the station around her, and thought about a 16-year-old girl in the undergrowth of a jungle moon. Perfectly still, perfectly patient, waiting for something to walk into the range she had already decided it was going to reach. Thought about 43 teenagers choosing the safest spot in a hostile terrain and going to sleep in it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Thought about what it meant to carry the accumulated survival knowledge of 200,000 years in your bones, in your instincts, in the way you read a forest floor, and the way you time your breathing, and the way you know without being told when it's safe to rest. The report would cause a stir. She knew that. The council would want meetings. There would be debates about classification systems and training framework revisions and what it meant for the Coalition's integrated cohort structure going forward. All of that would come. But right now, on a training moon below her, a Drathian cub and a human girl were walking toward the same transport, side by side, and from the audio feed, they were still talking. Vrethka turned off the display, sat in the dark for a moment. Then she smiled, which was not an expression her species used lightly, and she thought, we didn't know what we were looking at. We do now.